your presentation here shortly, and then I'll have to leave because I have other classes I go to. But I would like you to
Right.
introduce yourself, and then I'll just quietly mute myself, and I'll stay on until I see your presentations up and going and everything's good. But
Thank you,
I'm
Kathleen.
pleased that you did this class, and I think everyone's going to enjoy it. It's fascinating, and share the details of your personal involvement in this. And I've enjoyed talking to you very much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
I'm Dr. Jeff Grow, and I'm a professor at Lone Star College, Montgomery. But my area of specialization is not history. It is, oh, someone asked, are we supposed to hear you? Yes. So, Kathleen, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
You can
Probably
hear me,
it's
right?
on their end. I can hear you. It's on their PC. You need to look at your, and I'll chat a little bit on them. You
All
go
right.
ahead with your presentation and I'll chat with them, okay?
Thank you. Yes, I am not a professor of history. I'm a professor of mathematics, but I've spent 6 years in um, preparing, researching, creating, writing, and then um, now publishing my book. My book, let me bring this presentation up, is titled South Bottom, Virginia During the Civil War. So you may be wondering about South Bottom. Why South Bottom? Well, South Bottom is a place. As you can see by this road sign, there is a South Bottom Road. And also in local newspapers, sometimes a crime was committed and it was reported to have occurred in South Bottom. Okay. Why Bottom? By the way, this is a picture taken from South Bottom in the old Cache estate overlooking Grows Ridge at sunrise. So the Blue Ridge Mountains are there at the east, and this is the base of the mountains. Bottoms are rich farmlands adjacent in the valley adjacent to mountain ridges, mountainsides. And so there are two south rivers located in close proximity to one another. The south fork of the James River, so that's the South River of the James, and the south fork of the Shenandoah River. These are located only a couple miles away from each other. So I suppose a single bird flapping its wings might part a couple raindrops. One might fall into the basin of the south fork of the Shenandoah. Another might fall in the south fork of the James. And they would take a remarkable journey, traveling hundreds of miles apart, one traveling up to the Potomac River and joining and flowing out to the Atlantic through Hampton Roads. The other would flow down through the James River, flow through Richmond and out through Hampton Roads. So they might part for hundreds of miles and then come back again at the Hampton Roads, flowing out to the Atlantic Ocean. The South Fork of the James is the portion that's where my ancestors lived. They had been Pennsylvania Dutch, and they moved to this area about 1798. You can see here on the U.S. Geological Survey map published in 1936, Grows Ridge. Yes, and it's pronounced like Grow, Grow, Grows Ridge. And I can tell you that's how they pronounced it back then. I will have some documents that will show that. The South River of the James flows around here by this dotted red line. The dotted red. There's a railroad track in here that was not present in the antebellum period. And you can also see the Lee Jackson Highway up here that goes through Steele's Tavern. That also was not called the Lee Jackson Highway in the antebellum period. It was the Staunton Fairfield Turnpike in the antebellum period. But there's Big Spy Mountain and Little Spy Mountain and Grows Ridge, with the Spy Run joining up with the South River of the James right here, flowing south through the Shenandoah Valley. So this is kind of a midpoint in the valley. All rivers to the north flow north, all rivers to the south flow south. This is a piece of a map that was created by Jedediah Hotchkiss. Who was Jedediah Hotchkiss? He was the map maker, the cartographer for Stonewall Jackson. And after Stonewall Jackson died, he became the cartographer for General Lee. But on this map, you can see a farm named Crow. That would have been how he might have heard it for grow. There's also the Crowsons and the Cashes, Campbells, a whole bunch of C's right here. He just wrote it down as Crow. That's the exact location of the Grow family homestead, where they moved in 1798, owning about almost a square mile of land, going up into the mountainside as well. This is a picture of the South River of the James in springtime, so to give you an idea of the size. You know, the James River becomes navigable by ocean-going boats way to the east of Richmond, but at this point, it's just the South River of the James. It's a little stream, more or less, so you can get an idea of what the area looks like. This book is about my great-great-grandfather and his brother. My great-great-grandfather was Andrew Jackson Grow. He went by the name Jack. His brother was Samuel Cale Grow. Cale was his grandmother's maiden name, Cale. And Sam was born in 1834 and Jack was born in 1838. So these guys were of prime military age during the Civil War. You can see Jack is apparently here long after the war. This sort of rifle would not have existed in the antebellum period, where they used muskets and not rifles like this with cartridges. A number of important characters in my book are, well, William Grow was their father. He died in 1852, and leaving 6 of his children, including my great-great-grandfather and his brother Sam, leaving them as what were called orphans. At the time, to be an orphan meant that you were fatherless, even if your mother was still alive, and their mother was alive until 1866. So they were classified as orphans, which meant that they had to go before the court and request a guardian, a legal guardian. Their guardian ended up being their uncle, Philip. So Philip Grow became legal guardian to both Jack and Sam. This is their sister, Mary, and her husband, Christian Palmer. We have over here her sister, Christiana, their sister, Christiana, and her husband, Hiram Tharp. There are some other characters that appear in my book that are kind of, I guess, comedic characters, the way I write about them in the book. First is Major Dowell II Vines. His father's name was Major Dowell. He was not a major of any sort, but Major Dowell II Vines, his first name was just Major. And why Dowell II and then Vines? Apparently, his father, Major Dowell, and he had a falling out, and so he adopted his mother's maiden name, Vines. This is his wife, Sarah Margaret, or Maggie Newton Vines. She was the sister of John Newton, who became the administrator of the Grow estate. So she's somehow tangentially related in that way to the Grows. Part of my research was a discovery on my part that I wasn't really familiar with: the importance of the militia movement in Virginia and in other states throughout the South and also the North, starting in March of 1858. A number of militia groups like the West Augusta Guard in Augusta County, Virginia, started in March of 1858, 3 years before the beginning of the Civil War. One of the early leaders of the West Augusta Guard was William Henry Harmon, who left because he was raised to the level of brigadier general of the Virginia State Militia. His position as captain was taken over by William Smith Hanger Baylor. And the major general leading the Virginia State Militia was Kenton Harper. I want you to think about this. In 1858, the highest military rank in all of the United States, whether in the Virginia Militia or in the United States Army, was Major General. So Kenton Harper was raised within the highest rank in any military office. And he's a man who was never trained at West Point. He had been a captain of a unit during the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, but he just formed that company of guys, became its captain, and he never saw combat. So, despite being captain and in the war, he never saw combat. William Henry Harmon was a lieutenant under Captain Harper during the Mexican-American War, and he also was never West Point trained. None of these guys ever saw any training at West Point. The uniform being worn here by Kenton Harper is a Confederate uniform. Before the war, and even during the beginning of the Civil War, he wore blue U.S. Army uniform with big gold epaulets and a big hat with a great big feather plume. That's how he dressed himself until Stonewall Jackson arrived at Harpers Ferry, and fired him and replaced him and he actually moved him to a lower rank. He wanted to keep these people in the army, but not at the rank of major general. There's no way he deserved that at that point. He was never trained in the military arts, so he was incompetent. And he did leave only a couple months after being made colonel of the 5th Virginia Infantry as part of the Stonewall Brigade. This is a doctor's bill. You can see this is from April 21st and 22nd of 1852. It's by a guy named George Williams Dossey. The doctor was George Williams Dossey, a young guy, about 26 years old, who died the very next year. You can see this for William Grow. This is the main character's father. It also says up here at the top in pencil, left by J.D. and Bowden, John Daniel and Bowden, who was a local lawyer in the area, who we'll talk about more in a moment. But I wanted you to see something about this bill. It says here, visit and medicine, blistering, etc. Blistering, what is blistering? Blistering was a popular medical treatment at the time. It was a way of diverting the body's immune system from attacking one point to another. And so they would put a mustard agent, some kind of a blistering agent on the skin. It would develop these big blisters. Then they would pop those and leak them out onto a gauze. They thought it would be removing the bad miasmas. A lot of people know that George Washington was let. They drew blood from him before he died. They drew quite a lot of blood from George Washington before he died, and it probably killed him. But what a lot of people don't know is that George Washington was also blistered before he died. So this was a common medical treatment. All the way to 1852 here, you have this poor man who's sick and dying, William Grow, being administered blister agents by George Williams Dossey, his doctor. The bill here, 2 days visits, $5. $5 in gold today would be about $170 or $180. So that's about the charge for 2 days visits by the doctor back in 1852. The very next day, April 23rd, 1852, we have a receipt for making the coffin and hauling the same for the estate now of William Grow. So obviously the blistering and medicine administered by George Williams Dossey was not efficacious. It was of no use. And their father died 22nd of April, 1852, none the same. In the theme of those militia units being formed in 1858, here I have a picture of John Daniel and Bowden, who owned 24 slaves. A lot of these captains forming militia units, his unit was artillery. He formed the unit for the Staunton Rifles. Staunton was the major city in Augusta County, and he formed a militia unit for artillery, the Staunton Rifles, in 1858. He was also leading this artillery group at the First Battle of Bull Run, where in an act of bravado to try to show off his skill, he loaded the cannon himself, knelt in front of it without covering his ears to show off to Stonewall Jackson, and he had the cannon blown off without covering his ears. He blew his eardrum out and became permanently deaf in one ear. He eventually had to leave the artillery because he was deaf. and he spent time back in Staunton as a lawyer for a period of time before forming a group of partisan rangers, all mounted like cavalry, but partisan rangers. They went to the eastern portion of West Virginia and wreaked havoc there, killing people, destroying things, trying to interrupt rail traffic on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the B&O Railroad, which they did. But they also would kill people summarily without trial and destroy property, and they became such a nuisance that and an embarrassment that the Confederate Army had to fold their unit in to the part of the Confederate cavalry and take their the leadership away from Daniel and Bowen. He later became, as Brigadier General, he became a warden of a prisoner of war camp. And at the end of the war, he became one of the advocates for the warden at Hendersonville. This is a picture of the West Augusta Guard leadership taken about the time of the John Brown raid. This is Will Baylor, William Smith Hanger Baylor, that we saw earlier. He's here as captain with these gold epaulets, a blue U.S. Army uniform, all dressed in blue. They went with these uniforms into battle at First Manassas, or the First Bull Run. This is an important character in the book, John Brown. You may know the story that in October of 1859, he decided to raid the United States Armory in Harpers Ferry to try to steal tens of thousands of rifles to start a slave uprising. The plan was to obtain these rifles, distribute them to slaves, and then march all the way down to Mobile, Alabama from Virginia, and freeing the slaves as they went to start the ball rolling. Of course, he was surrounded by a brevet colonel, Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was in charge of the only military group nearby, a group of Marines that he commandeered and took to Harper's Ferry, surrounded John Brown, captured him, and John Brown was hanged. The president during the time was President Buchanan, who was elected in 1856. One of the worst presidents, in my opinion, the United States has ever had. He was definitely in over his head. He had no idea how to handle the situation. He thought that recent Supreme Court rulings would completely solve the problem of slavery for their time. But of course, he was completely wrong. He also was likely elected due to voter fraud or election fraud in 1856. There is testimony that I've read that the state of Pennsylvania offered the electoral votes up to the Republicans, but not receiving word back, they sold the electoral votes to the Democrats, and hence President Buchanan became president. Also, governor of Virginia at the time of the John Brown raid was Henry Alexander Wise. So Governor Wise might have tried to calm the passions of the Virginia people at the time of the John Brown raid, but he did not. He chose the alternative viewpoint and tried to whip up those passions as best he could. He actually, for him, the John Brown raid came too late. I think he was anticipating going to war with the North earlier. He helped to start the militia units in 1858, 3 years before the start of the Civil War. But he was going to leave the governorship early in 1860, and John Letcher would take over after Governor Wise left office. However, Governor Wise continued to have an important role helping to start the Civil War. Just before the war began, when Lincoln called up the 75,000 troops to occupy forts and armories after the bombing of Fort Sumter, John Daniel Bowen writes that he went to Governor Wise to help him go to Governor Letcher, persuade him to attack Harper's Ferry and take over the U.S. Armory there. Their plan at the time was to take those rifles and then use them to march on Washington, D.C. The presidential candidates during the 1860 presidential race were, of course, Abraham Lincoln, who was not the Republicans' first choice. He was selected on the third ballot, but he was considered to be moderate, more moderate than the other candidates who were principal ones vying for that position in the Republican Party at the time. Also, that he could bring in votes from the Midwest in Illinois and so forth. The candidate John Bell was candidate for the Constitutional Union Party. The Constitutional Union Party was a new party. It was basically half of the Whigs. The Whigs split to become Republicans, and then also the American Party, or the Constitutional Union Party, sometimes called the Know Nothings, the American Party. John Bell's principal value was union, and the way in which he intended to accomplish that was by basically caving into Southern demands on all points. So for people in the border states, they considered him the moderate candidate, and they likely would have considered him the peace candidate. The alternative to John Bell, in their point of view in the South, would have been John Breckinridge, the vice president of the United States under Buchanan. And John Breckinridge, he helped to split the Democrat Party with Stephen A. Douglas. John Breckinridge led the Southern Democrats, and Stephen A. Douglas led the Northern Democrats, the little giant, Stephen Douglas. Towards the end of the campaign, Stephen Douglas realized that he was definitely going to lose, and Abraham Lincoln was definitely going to win, with the Democrat split and also the vote divided with the Constitutional Union Party and John Bell. It was a shoo-in that Abraham Lincoln was going to win. He felt that the firebrands like John Breckinridge would then bolt and divide the nation, and that would lead to all kinds of problems. So Stephen Douglas went on a train trip through the South before the election, trying to persuade Southerners that they could withstand a Lincoln presidency. And it was interesting reading the transcripts of this. He spent in Montgomery, Alabama, he spent 3 hours. It had rained the previous night, so the group that came to him of 15,000 had to stand in the mud and listen to him for 3 hours as he spoke. And the thing is, those people who came to Montgomery, Alabama to listen to him were likely those more favorable to his point of view. The ones he needed to speak to were the ones in the countryside, and there was no way he could speak to them. Yes, Stephen Douglas was a failure on that score. Lincoln was elected, and the South did split. And shortly thereafter, Stephen Douglas died of typhoid fever, about 6 months after the election. Now, about literacy in South Bottom. There was an old court case from 1835 involving a guy named John Grow. You can see that he was not literate. He wrote his name with an X, and this is how he wrote his name on a legal document, with an X. His mark. John Grow, his mark. That's how they signed, with an X. Someone would write their name, they would put the X in the middle, and his mark over the top would be written for them. John Grow was fooled out of a property he purchased about 1828. He was illiterate, so he didn't have a contract, and the owner just refused to give him the deed when the price had already been paid. So he went to court and he lost. John Grow lost. In fact, the owner countersued for the trees that were cleared in order to make the farm, and so John Grow actually had to leave the state. His brother, William, did know how to read and write, and it was important then for the whole family, male, female, whomever, to learn how to read and write. This is the signature of his wife, Elizabeth Grow. So William Grow, who died in 1852, this is his actual signature with a seal. This is how you would seal something. Sign your seal, your promise, your oath to something. And this is the name of his wife written down on a receipt. The two main characters of the book I mentioned were Samuel Cale Grow. This is his actual signature on an affidavit. And Andrew Jackson Grow right here. Just before the war began, Philip Grow, their legal guardian, died at the age of 48, unexpectedly to himself and everyone else. He left 8 minor children. One of his minor children was a 15-year-old Isabella Grow. Now, Isabella, 15 years old, what are we going to do with her? There was an imperative to bring an adult male into the farm in order to run it. They needed an adult male to come in. And the way that they did that is they married Isabella off at the age of 15 to a guy named Thomas M. Crowson, who was 25 years old. Now, Isabella's mother, Margaret Grow, had to go to court. This was very young for a girl, even at the time, which is 1860. And she wrote, the clerk of Augusta County, the Augusta County Court, you will please let Thomas M. Crowson have license to marry my daughter, Isabella Grow. And you can see that she was a very phonetic speller. Margaret, Margret, Margaret, she spelled her first name just as she pronounced it. Grow, Grow. Her son, James W. Grow, spelled his last name Groah. So this is her son, James, who is 17, but still not of the age of majority, which was 21 at the time. And so he was not able to take control of the farm. And here's a witness, George Height. She was married on St. Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1861, 2 months before the outbreak of the war. And she was married by Reverend William Pinkerton. And that's the picture of the Reverend. Here are a few more of the captains of the 5th Virginia Infantry, the captains of militia units, Absalom Coiner, who was a lawyer, a politician, and then he retired from politics to be a farmer, but never trained at West Point. None of these guys were ever trained at West Point. John Henry Stover Funk was a medical doctor. He had just received his doctorate, and 14 months later, he was marched off to Harpers Ferry and part of the Civil War. So he was a captain of one of those companies of the 5th Virginia Infantry. Haziel Joseph Williams was a carpenter, never trained at West Point. And also, but one thing about Haziel here, I must say, is that he was humble and he would get down and dig in the ditch with the guys. So he was not the sort who would put himself above others. Absalom Coiner was supposed to be snarky and not a good person, just vindictive and bad. He was not elected as captain. At the end of the first year of the war, he was sent back to serve in the reserves, rejected by his men. So on the 9th of April, a storm blew through Virginia, knocking out telegraph lines and preventing the publication of newspapers. You had sleet and snow and rain, railroad bridges washed out. No news from the east came to Staunton, Virginia, the major city in Augusta County, South Bottom just below that. For the next, until the 16th. You may know that on the 12th of April, 1861, we had the bombing of Fort Sumter, which was regarded as the beginning of the war. On the 15th, President Lincoln called up, he realized forts and armories throughout the South are not well garrisoned. Even Harpers Ferry had only 50 men, and they were led by a first lieutenant. So it was very lightly garrisoned. And they had thousands of rifles there, and those could easily be captured. So Lincoln found himself in a panic. He called up 75,000 men to occupy forts and armories throughout the South. So this put an imperative on the people in Virginia who were advocates of the use of these militias. The purpose of the militias was to stand up an army in the South, which they were not legally allowed to do by the Constitution, but militias were a strong tradition in the United States. And so they made these militias all throughout the South to stand up an army so they could get ready to secede, capture United States forts and armories, and then try to renegotiate re-entry into the Union on strength in terms of the strength of having all of these weapons and perhaps obtain better terms. So on the 17th, the militias from Augusta County were called up. Two of them, the West Augusta Guard and the Staunton Rifles, went by train to Richmond, and then from there up to Harpers Ferry. They arrived on the 18th at about close to midnight, and then they attacked on the 19th. But by the time they attacked, the first lieutenant in Harpers Ferry's munitions storage area realized that it was hopeless to defend against hundreds of militia men with cannon with his 50 men. So he set the munitions ablaze and fled, which was the smart thing to do. And any first lieutenant should know, when you're surrounded by overwhelming force, then you destroy the weapons and don't allow them to fall into the enemy's hands. It was like I say, the position of people like Imboden, John Daniel Imboden, to take those arms and march directly on Washington, D.C. So by burning those weapons, he spared Washington, D.C. The camp at Harpers Ferry was in complete disorder under Major General Kenton Harper. who led until the arrival of Thomas J. Jackson. Harper saw, marching around with his plumed hat and his gold epaulets, usually with a retinue of lackeys, had no commissary set up. He did not have latrines set up. He did not organize the men according to companies, regiments, brigades, divisions. He had no order set up in the camp. There were food shipments by train to supply the militiamen who had gathered there, among whom were my two ancestors, Andrew Jackson Grow. And the reason that they were required to be there is that in 1860, in January of 1860, the Virginia State Legislature passed a law requiring all military-age males to register with a local militia or be subject to fine. And so they were compelled to be part of the Virginia militia after the John Brown raid. That was the Virginia response. When Thomas Jackson got there, he had come from the Virginia Military Institute as a professor of mathematics and physics. He taught calculus and he taught physics at the Virginia Military Institute. Not very well, I might add. It said that when students asked him questions, he would repeat his memorized lecture word for word. So he was not able to answer questions very effectively. But he was a very good military leader, organizing the commissary and the latrines and the organization by regiments and divisions and whatnot, and cleaned up the camp and got them organized. He also organized the secession vote, the Ordinance of Secession. This is my wife's thumb. We actually found these documents in the Library of Virginia in Richmond. And you'll see that in the secession vote for the 5th Virginia Infantry, actually they called it the 3rd Regiment of the Provisional Army of Virginia at the time, because the Confederate Army was not part of this at this point. You can see Colonel Kenton Harper written down here, Lieutenant Colonel William H. Harmon, Major William Smith Hanger Baylor. These guys wrote their names down first for ratification of the Ordinance of Secession. And I'd like you to take a look at this other column here. Now, it turns out that the vote was 365 to 0 in favor of secession, but there were at least 200 more men there who just didn't vote. And after all, would you want your name to be the first one here next to the colonel's for rejection? And where would that put you? These records were permanently stored with your name and your preference in Richmond. They could always look up, how did that person vote for secession? And if they knew that you were one of those who was against secession, might they put you on the front line, make things really hard for you perhaps? But here's a signature, T.J. Jackson, Colonel of Virginia Volunteers, commanding Harpers Ferry. So that's his certification of the vote. By the way, the count was incorrect. They made 7 errors that they caught. The 7 errors they caught were numbers that they missed. They might have jumped from 274 to 276. Well, where was 275? Well, they just skipped over it. They caught all of those numbers that they skipped over. What they didn't catch is a number that they repeated twice, vote 324. And so I searched, and it turns out Andrew Jackson Grow and Samuel Cale Grow did not vote during the secession vote. It would have risked their lives had they voted for rejection. And these boys were members of the German Reformed Church, which was opposed to slavery. These guys would have been opposed to slavery from their youth. But these are the flags they fought under initially. Over on the far upper left, you can see the Confederate flag. This is the flag of the Confederacy, the nation of the Confederacy, their national flag. And this is the flag of the 5th Virginia Infantry, the actual flag, the battle flag of the 5th Virginia Infantry, where it says liberty or death, with the Confederate flag being held by an eagle. So they found themselves in Harpers Ferry, and they had to sign up for 1 year service under the militia law. Their unit was transferred to the Provisional Army of Virginia and then to the Confederate Army. So by their association with the Virginia militia, they became members of the Confederate Army. stationed at Harpers Ferry. You can see that the Bolivar Peninsula here is between Maryland Heights and Loudoun Heights. They initially had artillery set up on both mountain sides overlooking Harpers Ferry. That was necessary for the Confederate Army to hold if they were going to hold Harpers Ferry. If they didn't hold Maryland Heights, that would be a risk for the Union to put artillery up there and just bomb the heck out of people down at Harpers Ferry. However, Jeff Davis, who was West Point trained, who had military service with honor in the Mexican-American War, was injured, wounded there in the foot, and who considered himself something of a military genius, ordered that the artillery be removed from Maryland Heights because he didn't want it to appear to the governor of Maryland that they were invading Maryland. He was still hoping that Maryland would come in on the side of the Confederacy, and if it did, that would have the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. surrounded, and the U.S. would have to remove the capital from Washington, D.C. to some other location. So they removed cannon from this point, which left the Bolivar Peninsula and Harpers Ferry completely open to attack, which meant that eventually, with U.S. taking up cannon positions in this position, the Confederate Army here had to withdraw to Winchester. So while there, they had the first action, and that was the Battle of Falling Waters. U.S. Army was coming across the river. The 5th Virginia Infantry was one of several regiments set in to form a rear guard action to slow these guys down while retreating. And several members of the regiment were killed that day, I think 9 altogether, in the Battle of Falling Water. But they were successful, so successful with their rapid rate of fire and the training under Stonewall Jackson, that the Union thought there were twice as many Confederate troops present, and they stopped and waited. So while they were stopping and waiting right here, it became imperative to send those troops from the valley, from Winchester, down to Manassas Junction, where the U.S. forces were getting set to attack the Confederate Army, Army of Northern Virginia, here in Manassas Junction. The battle was over the railroad, right here, the railroad crossing, the junction, the thought being that it's easy to supply a raid on the capital Richmond if the United States Army could capture the rail. Without the rail, it takes a lot more effort to transport material by wagon, a lot more. And so the men from Winchester were marched down across the river, the Shenandoah River, to Piedmont Station, and then by rail down to Manassas Junction, where they joined the others. The battle there it started out badly for the Confederates. They were in a superior position. The battle lines arch outward toward the Union lines, giving the Confederates interior lines by which they could resupply different points in the line more easily than the Union could. And General B, everyone knew that the standard philosophy of war required that the Union should try to flank the Confederates. Jeff Davis thought that the Union would try to flank the right Confederate flank. In fact, they went for the left flank. And in the morning, there was a general routing of the Confederate forces here, with the Confederate forces retreating back to Henry Hill. General B in command of that sector that morning. If you were in the back here, behind the Confederate lines, all you would have seen that morning were injured and wounded fleeing back to take up positions, to hide, go back to the hospital. But ultimately, by about noon, Thomas Jackson's forces were sent forward. They put themselves just below the crest of the hill, so they couldn't be seen by the Union forces. The 33rd Virginia Infantry was angled at a right angle to the rest of the line. The reason that they were in that position is that at least 200 members of their regiment was ill with the measles and had to be left at Winchester. So they had 650 men in the regiment, 200 of them left behind with illnesses, mostly the measles. And so they had 450 men, which is a very small regiment at the time. So the others, they just formed a guard against a flanking attack at the end, which made them susceptible to Union artillery located on Dogan's Ridge, which the Union artillery figured out the poor positioning of the 33rd Infantry, and they started shelling them with very good effect. This so freaked out the men of the 33rd that they almost fled. The colonel of the 33rd had been ordered by Thomas Jackson to stay put until the Union forces were within 30 yards of his position and then to fire. But fearing that his group would flee if he didn't do something, he ordered them to attack forward against the Union artillery on Dogan's Ridge. So they, in violation of orders, attacked. And Thomas Jackson, riding a horse up here on the hill, just decided to watch and see what happened. And the 33rd were all dressed in blue U.S. Army uniforms. They got close to these artillery units over here, and the men in the U.S. artillery thought that they were Union forces because they were dressed in blue. So they let them get close. They got them within about 30 yards. The 33rd opened fire, slaughtering the men holding those cannons. And so they were able to capture them. A couple of their Union regiments came in and drove the 33rd back, and there was a seesaw back and forth as the 4th and 27th were sent in, and then ultimately the 2nd and then the 5th sent in to reinforce the battle raging there over those guns. The Union were all in at this point. Stonewall Jackson was all in after having sent in the 5th when another reinforcement of Confederate troops appeared on the hill, and then it was clear that the Confederates were definitely in a position superior to the Union, and Union forces fled. First by a fighting retreat until they got back a certain distance, and then they dropped their guns and ran. When the Confederate forces got to the river, and at that point, Jeff Davis ordered them to halt, where the genius, Jeff Davis, ordered them to halt and regroup, I guess out of fear. It wasn't until November of 1861 that they adopted this flag, which is the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. Some people call this the rebel flag or the Confederate flag. This is the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. That's exactly what it is. So there wasn't a lot of action, just people dying from disease mostly. The camp outside of Manassas became known as Camp Maggot. It was so filled with disease and filth and stench. It wasn't until the middle of December that the 5th Virginia Infantry had its next action, the Stonewall Brigade, actually the Army of the Shenandoah at this point, attacking Dam Number 5 in the middle of December, which ultimately, through some false movements and feints, Stonewall Jackson was able to destroy, and they went back. The next action on their part occurred on January 1st, 1862, which is a very bad day to march. January 1st. Stonewall Jackson should have known better, but he sent his entire army up to attack Romney. To get there, with mountains in between, they had to go up to the Potomac and down. But on the first day, first half day, weather was good, but midday, a blizzard blew through. Because of the poor weather conditions, the wagon train was slow in getting to the campsite that evening, and the men had to bivouac in the snow without dinner. So they woke up, the wagon train was still not present. They had to march without breakfast, without lunch, without dinner. Well, I guess they would have called it lunch, dinner, and supper. And they bivouacked in the snow on the 2nd of January without any food that day. They woke up on the 3rd of January, and the wagon train had finally caught up. They had a meal that morning, and then they marched all day, and then there was no meal that night. They bivouacked in the snow on the 3rd without dinner or supper. And so they had a very slow slog in snow, slush, and ice the entire way to Romney. It took them twice the normal amount of time. Men were dying of various diseases, pneumonia, becoming sick, being left in homes along the way, to the tune of hundreds of men left in homes along the way. Men having frostbite, having to have toes amputated, feet amputated because of the bitter cold. General Stonewall Jackson, by the way, remained in Winchester in his nice, warm, comfortable quarters. The generals who went to Romney with this group under Stonewall Jackson's command complained to the Confederate Congress, and ultimately the Confederate Jeff Davis, had to order them to go back to Winchester, at which point Stonewall Jackson offered his resignation letter, but that was rejected. The next major military operation was at was in just south of Winchester, and it was a V1 and only. It's called First Kernstown is the name of the battle. First Kernstown, the one and only defeat of Stonewall Jackson on record. Though Stonewall Jackson never considered First Kernstown to be a defeat. He was overwhelmed by maybe 35,000 Union forces on the other side, with his small forces from the Shenandoah here, including the old Stonewall Brigade. The Stonewall Brigade at that time was led by General Garnett. General Garnett had most of his regiments here at the front line engaged in battle all day, but with the 5th Virginia Infantry held in reserve most of the day. His men ran out of ammunition, and Stonewall Jackson ordered them to stay there and fix bayonets, but being completely overwhelmed, General Garnett ordered the general withdrawal of his brigade, sending in the 5th Virginia to provide cover for a fighting retreat. And so the 5th Virginia only lost 14% of its force that day, killed and wounded and captured, whereas the rest of the Stonewall Brigade lost 25%. So they suffered very heavy casualties that day. After the battle, General Garnett was arrested for disobeying orders, and General Lee had to step in and transfer Garnett to his own army, the Army of Northern Virginia, where because they couldn't be just sentencing and prosecuting their well-trained generals, they needed them. Garnett, in order to save his reputation in the Battle of Gettysburg, rode his horse up to the front where he was shot and killed. So why did Stonewall Jackson believe that he won at Kernstown? It's because his strategic objective was to keep the Union Army in the Shenandoah Valley and away from joining the McClellan's Peninsula campaign that year. And because of the battle, the U.S. government kept these forces in the Shenandoah Valley, and so Stonewall Jackson achieved his strategic objective. Nonetheless, his defeated army regrouped at Rude's Hill. They did this in April of 1862. Now, these men had signed on for 1 year of service, and that service would end on the 17th of April, including for my great-great-grandfather Jack and his brother Sam. Now, there were another couple of things going on that would have been motivations to leave the Army, despite the fact that the Confederate Congress was debating a bill to force these men into 2 additional years of service or until the end of the war for the duration. And that is, first of all, as the men were coming back to Rude's Hills, there were stragglers. There were people taking their sweet time, maybe hanging out in Mount Jackson and not going back to camp. He had them arrested, about 30 of them, and had them tortured. He had them bucked and gagged in front of the entire division. And that would have been a powerful motivator to no longer be part of that army if you could, because they then were violating something that was part of the Constitution, violations against unusual punishments, but they weren't living under that Constitution anymore. They were living under the Confederate government. And so they, for guys who didn't believe in slavery and who didn't believe in the Confederate, there were many people in the Confederate Army who did not believe in the Confederate experiment and what they were fighting for. Also, there was something called the Rockingham Rebellion. You see that little Dunker church down there? The Dunker Church? Well, these were German Baptists, and they did not believe in serving in the Confederate Army. There were about 500 of them who gathered at Swift Run Gap in the Blue Ridge and decided that they were going to resist being forced into the Confederate Army, and they would use their hunting rifles, their squirrel rifles, their shotguns, whatever they had, to try to resist being brought into the Confederate Army. Confederate cavalry couldn't reach them up in the mountains, and the Confederate Army the few soldiers who were there were too afraid to go and pursue them up in the mountains where they could be easily picked off, And so General Stonewall Jackson ordered artillery to bomb them out of the forest, which they did. Most of them got away and were transported by the Underground Railroad to New Creek and then on to West Virginia and then to Pennsylvania, where they could either avoid service or join the U.S. forces. About 50 of them were captured, however, by the Confederate Army and forced into service in the Confederate Army. So there was the Rockingham Rebellion, there was torture, there was defeat, there was disease running rampant through. And on the 6th of April, 1862, Andrew Jackson Grow and Samuel Cale Grow deserted the Confederate Army. This is an important decision point, a moral decision point. What are they going to do? Well, back home, they had their 65-year-old mother to take care of. Their legal guardian, Philip, had died, and her, Margaret had 8 minor children to take care of. So they needed some men to come down and help support them. There was a desperate family situation back home. And so rather than go to the North and fight for the Union at this point, they went home. Now, in July of 1862, there was a shootout on the Grow estate, and a member of the provost guard who was sent to arrest these deserters was shot and wounded. This was in July. The man who was shot was named Robert Samuel Galladay. He went by the name Sam. Now, Sam Galladay was no favorite of the Confederates. He, in fact, even though he was serving as a military police to arrest deserters, he deserted the Confederate Army in December of 1862 and joined the U.S. forces in Tennessee as part of the cavalry. So even those serving as police forces trying to arrest deserters would sometimes desert and not be in favor of the Confederate Army. But you can see that as a result of the shootout and the wounding of Robert Samuel Galladay on the Grow property, this poster was created on August 7th of 1862 to arrest a group of deserters. So you can clearly see Samuel Cale Grow here and Andrew Jackson Grow. Their mother's maiden name was Zink, so Andrew J. Zink was their cousin. Andrew J. Zink's sister, Elizabeth Zink, married James G. Carrier, so they're related in that sense. Thomas M. Croson married Isabella Grow, their cousin. Elisha Weeks was not a family relation, but he was a friend. In fact, he bought a red heifer at the estate sale for Philip Grow. Cornelius Hem doesn't seem to be related to this group in any way, other than the fact that he took a furlough and a bounty in February of 1862 to go home and never came back. And I think that's why he was put on here. The letter also mentions a lot of other people not reporting sick, but not having seen a doctor, and he threatens putting them in jail and trying them for desertion if they don't show up. But these were picked out specially. There were lots of deserters. In fact, in the 52nd Virginia Infantry, there were perhaps 200 deserters. This is a huge proportion of the regiment. And they actually published these people's names in the local newspaper at some point. This ultimately became an embarrassment to the Confederacy. They stopped doing it. But 2 months after the reward poster was posted, there was another shootout on the Grow estate. And in that shootout, Elisha Weeks was killed, and another member of the Provost Guard was shot and wounded. His name was William Height. So Elisha Weeks was shot and killed in a shootout with Provost Guard, in which William Height was also shot and wounded, but lived. Elisha Weeks' wife, Lucy, was 2 months pregnant at the time. And I wondered about the fate of that baby, who was born in May of 1863. His name was Henry Elisha Weeks. And it turns out 35 years later, Henry Elisha Weeks was murdered by Benjamin Loudon Height. So you can see the bad blood persisted long after this war. There was a certain amount of desperation back home, and they needed money. So they sold a portion of the land. Notice the estate administrator is John Newton. John Newton was the father of James W. Newton, the captain of Sam and Jack Grow in the 5th Virginia Infantry. So there is good reason to believe there's kind of a conflict of interest here. He never should have been serving as administrator to the Grow estate. but as county commissioner, he was appointed to that role, and he served in that role throughout the rest of the war. They sold 334 acres, and the sale was on the 28th of February, 1863. They sold this land. The payment was in 3 equal payments. The first payment after 6 months and 2 annual payments after that. The last payment coming due the 28th of August, 1865. The last payment due on the land sold during the Civil War came due after the Civil War ended, which is kind of important because the land was sold in Confederate dollars. The sale was denominated in Confederate dollars. So that last payment had to be recalculated, redenominated. And who was going to redenominate that last payment? The administrator of the estate, John Newton, as you'll see. So the Grow boys camped out in the Blue Ridge Mountains until the next year, when they took their sister and husband, Christy and Hiram Tharp, with their 4 children. Hiram's mother died of diphtheria in December of 1862, and needed to get Hiram Tharp then needed to get to her estate so he could take it over. Hardee County in Virginia was actually part of West Virginia at that point. West Virginia split off and it became a state in 1863. So to get there, it was actually not as hard getting there as it was to get to the Union forces after that. Hardee County was controlled by the Confederate Rangers, operated under John Daniel Imboden. So Imboden was in control of that area at the time. After they took their sister and her family to Hardee County to take over that estate, they just continued on to Beverly, West Virginia, where they surrendered themselves to the United States Army and were transported to Wheeling Prison. From Wheeling Prison, they were transported to Pittsburgh, where they both joined the United States forces. Now, Jack went with one regiment and Sam went with another. Sam went with the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, which was under Second Corps. Second Corps was led by General Hancock. The 1st Division, and this is the 1st Division flag, this is the actual flag that they used during the Civil War. This flag struck fear in the rebel hearts because this flag meant the rebels were soon to see severe punishment. This flag flew under General Barlow. General Brooke was the commander of the 4th Brigade of the 1st Division of 2nd Corps, and the commander of the regiment. This is a similar flag to the regimental flag of the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry that Sam fought under. This is the colonel at the time, James Adams Beaver. He eventually became a brigadier general, but soon thereafter lost his leg at the Battle of Ream Station. This is similar to the flag. I'll show you the actual battle flag later, and you'll understand why I had to show you this one first at that time. Jack, on the other hand, joined the 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery, also called the 152nd Regiment of Pennsylvania Volunteers. This is their regimental flag, their battle flag. So Jack was stationed at Fort Monroe near Hampton Roads. This is a picture that I took of the moat and the wall there at Fort Monroe. This is a photograph of soldiers at Fort Monroe taken in December of 1863. This then would have perhaps shown Jack in here someplace. Jack is standing out there someplace as part of this regiment. One of the features of the fort would have been the Lincoln gun, weighing about 49,000 pounds. The foundation for the gun weighed about 80 tons. It could launch a 400-pound projectile 4 or 5 miles, shutting down ship traffic. You can see a masted ship back here, shutting down ship traffic through Hampton Roads. Even for, say, one of those ironclads, probably couldn't stand up to one of these big balls coming down, raining down upon them. This is a picture of that gun today that I took inside of Fort Monroe. One of Jack's leaders would have been Charles Heckman. One of the first campaigns he led them on was an attempt by the Southerners to test U.S. forces in Norfolk in February of 1864. And he had the men wheel their their cannons up onto a ship, steam-powered ships, tooted over to Norfolk, got aboard trains, were trained right to the front, and then set up such a withering barrage that the Confederates lost their will and went back into their winter quarters. At the beginning of the campaign of 1864, in May, the men of the 3rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry were shipped to Bermuda 100 along with General Heckman in an attempt to drive towards Richmond from that side. General Grant would come down from the north with the Army of the Potomac, General Butler from the east in the Army of the James, and General Heckman being one of Butler's generals. However, during that campaign, General Heckman found his troops involved in a terrible fog. The fog was said to be so thick you couldn't see a man 6 feet away from you, and apparently the fog was not so thick that Confederate soldiers couldn't run into General Heckman and capture him. So he was taken captive and ultimately was traded. They could trade soldiers for soldiers, prisoners for prisoners, and he was ultimately traded back. Sam, on the other hand, when he started the campaign, he started with their camp in Stevensburg in the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, one small regiment and a lot of regiments being led by General Grant. They marched down across Ely's Ford and down to Chancellorsville, where they saw bones from the men poking up through the soil from the battle there the previous year. From there, they marched over to the Wilderness. During the Battle of the Wilderness, which was a great battle, one of the big battles of the war, they were mostly spectators. They called themselves spectators to the concert of death. And they only lost one man in the Battle of the Wilderness, mostly serving to try to flank in the Confederate troops. Because they were so far down to the southern end of the Union line, they were one of the last regiments to leave. And so regiments would back up and then come down towards Todd's Tavern and then down towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. On the way, a major battle for the 148th involved a reconnaissance in force by Second Corps. 3 divisions of Second Corps were sent through different points along the Po River to try to find a way to flank around Confederate troops located at Spotsylvania Courthouse. But the Confederates were so well entrenched over here, they couldn't cross the Po River here the second time, and so they had to go back. Grant ordered them all back to make a frontal assault on the lines at Spotsylvania Courthouse. So the 148th served as rear guard for the 1st Division of Second Corps as they crossed back across the river. They became heavily engaged with 2 divisions of Confederate Army attacking the fleeing forces, and they were to hold them off. Because of the fires erupting all around them, the orders to withdraw never arrived, and they stayed as long as they could until Colonel Beaver decided that either they're going to be all killed or captured, or he's going to be court-martialed for pulling them back without orders. So it was such an emergency, he decided to pull them all back. They left so hastily that some of the men who were wounded were left there, and they were consumed in the fires alive. So this is a particular engagement where they perhaps lost 200 men. When they marched south, their adjutant said that they had 722 muskets. So this was the first baptism by fire of the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, where they would then regroup and attack by frontal assault the Confederate forces located at Spotsylvania Courthouse. The 148th came into the right corner of what is called the salient, or the horseshoe. A salient is a bulge in the lines. And salients are inherently unstable because they have what is called diverging fire, the fire becoming farther and farther spread out as it goes out, whereas the people who are attacking a salient have converging fire becoming more and more intense as it goes in. The General Johnson, who was in command of a portion of this line here, the salient, had assuredly that he could keep it as long as he could keep his cannons, his guns. But Lee became concerned that Grant was going to flank him again, like he did at the Wilderness, and so he pulled 20 of these guns out. But because Grant was intending to send 20,000 men into this spot, he had like 80-some-odd thousand men at the time, he was going to send 20,000 of them into this particular salient. They were all getting ready over here. Union artillery lined up right here, the Landrum House over here. General Johnson he begged Lee to send him back his cannon. He was able to get 2 of them back to get off a couple shots as the men came across the open ground in the morning, about 4:45 in the morning. But the other 18 cannon that were withdrawn were captured as they were rolling into place by soldiers spilling over the rebel fortifications here. The men in the 148th and other Union forces were marching as though on parade, right shoulder arms into the works. If the Confederate cannon had been there that morning, they could have taken out hundreds of them with a single shot. But those cannons weren't there, and they were able to then go over this area. And on the other side, where Sam went, right here, was the Stonewall Brigade. The Stonewall Brigade ceased to exist that morning. A brigade typically has thousands of soldiers. The Stonewall Brigade, at the end of that day, the 12th of May, 1864, had 260 men left in the brigade. Many of them had been on assignment and not at the front that morning, and that's how they escaped this punishment of being either killed or captured that morning. But Sam was on the winning side. He had joined the Union Army and had faced a terrible, terrible onslaught. Later that morning, the Union forces formed a line across the middle with the 148th hard up against the Confederate works. Their lieutenant colonel was wounded, and the captain of Sam's company was killed in this action. Later that morning, they were forced back to the original line in the morning, and by 9 o'clock in the morning, they were ordered to shift ground over to the Bloody Angle. So later that morning, they actually stepped over men of the 6th Corps who were lying on the ground, had never been involved or engaged that morning. They were asked to march over those men and then proceed to the front, right on the lines, which they did. And the colonel of the 148th always wondered why those other men had never been sent in. They used all of their ammunition there, and they went back to the guys lying on the ground in 6th Corps, got their ammunition, and then brought them back. And they kept themselves fighting until they were completely out of ammunition. When they were finally out of ammunition, General Brooke went back and asked, "What are we going to do? There's no more ammunition." And they were told that at all hazards, they must fix bayonets and maintain their positions, which they did. Later that night, the Confederate forces withdrew to a secondary line, leaving the Union forces in control of this line, but no one in control of the no man's land out between, where all of the trees were turned into splinters that day. It rained the entire day. It was a muddy, mucky, bloody mess. Bodies stacked 8 deep in spots. This is the Jedediah Hotchkiss map drawn by the Lee's cartographer of the salient and of the battle lines for the Confederates that day. Spotsylvania Courthouse. From there, they went down to North Anna River, which is the location of another rail junction, as you can see. And then after a minor engagement there, down to Totopotomoy Creek, which in Grant's autobiography, he calls it Photopotomoy, and then to Cold Harbor, where there was a major attack, a major battle at Cold Harbor, which was anything but cold. It was hot in June as they duked it out right there at Cold Harbor. A line several miles long, 7 miles long. You had artillery bursting in the air. Confederate artillery could be timed to burst in the air and rain hot steel down on the unsuspecting down below, which took out at least a couple of the colonels of the 104, a couple of the brigadier generals of the brigade to which the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteers belonged. At which point, after a couple colonels were lost, in fact, 10% of the officer corps, U.S. officer corps, was either killed or wounded at Cold Harbor. This was a terrible, terrible battle. After the battle at Cold Harbor, they pulled down and went across the James to Petersburg, but not before the entire Second Corps was misdirected, possibly through Confederate spies, and went the wrong way for several hours. They had to backtrack, arriving at Petersburg too late to assist in the assault on the lines at Petersburg that day. If they had gotten there a couple hours earlier, all of the men on the walls and the parapets protecting Petersburg at the early point were young boys and old men. By the time the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteers got there, General Lee had finally figured out where Grant had snuck his army. Lee had been petrified for days, not knowing where Grant had sent his army, thinking it was impossible for Grant to do what he did. But he had figured it out, and he had fresh veteran soldiers lining the barricades all the way along Petersburg. These had been dug in for years and were now, with veteran soldiers, virtually impenetrable. Not that they didn't try. Within the next day or two, the 148th was asked to assault one of these redoubts here, which they tried, but their Colonel Beaver was hit by a cannon blast, and a piece of shrapnel hit him in the side, and he was out of the war for a couple months until their next major engagement. Well, there was a major engagement at Deep Bottom, but there's a major engagement I'd like to talk about is the one at Green Station. 2 divisions of Second Corps were sent to destroy railroad in Reams Station, down to Reams Station. This had been a supply route for the Confederate Army. And if you think about it, a wagon needs at least a couple drivers, but you need another wagon to feed the horses, and you need another 4 horses to put in rotation for the 2 horses that normally would pull that wagon. So you need at least 6 horses and 4 men to run just one wagon, but it's going to take 2 wagons to do it. So if you have 100 wagons, it's going to take a lot of people, a lot of horses, a lot of forage for the beasts, whatever. You could put everything on one train run by 12 men, and it can get there a lot faster. So railroads were critical to the conduct of the war for the Confederates. To destroy this railroad was important. The war might have ended differently had General Grant not gotten the flu, and the control of what was happening at Reams Station was taken over by General Meade, who was definitely a lesser general to Grant. These are the battle lines at Reams Station. The station being about here, the Union lines making this weird arch with Confederate forces coming in. As I said, there were 2 Union divisions. There were 6 Confederate divisions. Even so, the adjutant of the 148th said that the Confederate forces were looking pretty shabby as they were marching along. And it looked, as they became engaged in hand-to-hand combat over these waist-high, poorly dug-in Union entrenchments, it looked like to him that the Confederate forces might turn and flee. But at a critical moment, a Green New York regiment located near this corner fled back to the railroad cut. Consequently, Confederate soldiers rallied and came in and captured several U.S. cannons and turned them down for enfilading fire down U.S. lines, which were so devastating, because a single shot might kill a dozen people, that the entire U.S. line fled. So this was a big defeat for Second Corps, who went back licking their wounds in front of Petersburg, having lost about at least 2,500 men captured that day. This is what the battle might have looked like. It was the battle line was at least 4 miles long. It may not have looked like that in the previous battle drawn up for General Hancock and Second Corps. But this is what it would have looked like as a wood carving here. But just think about this continuing on for 4 miles. In fact, some of the men present said that the Confederate forces looked like they did at Gettysburg, just smaller in scale. So Gettysburg, battle line 7 miles, Reams Station, battle lines 4 miles. Very similar, though, in how it appeared. So at about that time, about September, October of 1864, Jack, who's in the 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery, became ill and went to the hospital. This is the main hospital in the back, and there's the temporary hospital structures in the front. So he spent the next couple months in the hospital, and ultimately he became permanently disabled, but not until much after the war, as you'll see. About that time, the 148th Pennsylvania, serving on the front lines in Petersburg, became engaged in another battle. This battle was precipitated by Grant wanting to do something to help Lincoln's campaign efforts. So he wanted to cut off more of the supply lines for the Confederates in the South, but to do that, he needed a diversion. He wanted to keep Lee's eyes fixed on a different point in the line. To do that, he wanted to send some men in on a mission that he knew was not going to be successful, a direct attack on the Confederate lines there at Petersburg. He wanted this to be limited in scale, and so he wanted only 100 men. So he chose 100 men from the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. Since they were down to 149, that's most of the regiment. They had started with 722 muskets, you recall. They were down to 149 at the end of this engagement. So they were decimated that year, that 5.5, 6 months. That they were asked to make a frontal assault on the Confederate lines here, which they did, because they had received earlier that month Spencer repeating rifles, where they could shoot 7 shots and then put in more cartridges and shoot another 7 shots. They were able to capture the Confederate lines there, and they really believed that if they had support from additional regiments brought in, they could divide the Confederate line and roll up the Confederate defenses and capture Petersburg that day. But those were never sent because they had never been intended to be sent. And when Captain Jerry Z. Brown, who received the Medal of Honor, by the way, for this action, when he was asked, well, he asked General Brooke, why did we not receive reinforcements? And he was told, frankly, Captain, we never expected a single one of you to breach those barricades or to return. So they were sent on a suicide mission. 33 of them did not return, of the 100 who were sent in. Later that year, Jack at Fort Monroe was tasked with his entire regiment, the 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery, with distributing Christmas gifts around the fort, which they did. Why were these guys in particular tasked with sending out Christmas gifts? Most of the men of the 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery had been recruited from prisoner of war camps. So these are former Confederate soldiers who were persuaded to join the United States Army. By the way, throughout the war, 800 of them deserted and went home, just walked away and went home. 800, that's more than the entire regiment. That's about the size of a regiment at the time. But they were very successful in always bringing in more guys. In fact, they had split off a whole regiment from this regiment, and they still shipped more guys in and found themselves at too high a strength, overstrength. They kept on finding themselves overstrength in the 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery throughout the war, which is the exact opposite problem that the Confederate Army had, always in a desperate struggle for manpower in the southern side. But Jack was a Christmas elf in December of 1864. Sam, in December of 1864, was sent as an aide in the 1st Division of 2nd Corps headquarters, which is kind of away from the front. And so he was not engaged in a lot of battles after that, but he was engaged. He was sent back with the men when they marched towards Appomattox, and then was with the men as they marched through Richmond in a show of force to the defeated Confederate Army after Lee's surrender. And then they marched in Washington, D.C. in a parade. And this is a picture of the parade in Washington, D.C. as the entire Army of the Potomac marched through. I'm showing you now the actual national colors and battle flag of the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, who were involved in every major battle virtually, other than, say, the Wilderness, of Grant's overland campaign. You can see that these men suffered and struggled very mightily. Just looking at these flags, you can see this. After that, after Lee's surrender, Jack was reassigned to the 4th United States Volunteer Infantry and was sent to the Dakota Territories. They boarded a ship named the Illinois, landed in New York, where they traveled by train all the way to St. Louis. By the time they got there, 10% of his regiment had deserted. Then they traveled. The U.S. Army had reserved 15 paddle boats, river boats, to power themselves up the Missouri River, where they disembarked at Sioux City, Iowa. And from Sioux City, they marched on foot the remaining um, 600 miles or so to Fort Sully in the Dakota Territories. This is a picture of Fort Sully. You'll note that there are native tribes camped outside of Fort Sully. These were the peaceful Yanktons, who were relying upon the United States Army for military protection from other native tribes who would have annihilated them without the U.S. fort in this place. Shortly after Jack arrived, he became terribly ill and had to be taken back all those miles back to Sioux City, Iowa. And he remained in the hospital from September of 1865 until November 27th of 1865. Usually by the first week of December, the Missouri River at that time would freeze over at Sioux City, Iowa, and you could not send paddle boats up or down the river at that point. It would be cut off by the ice in the river. So it was imperative to get someone who was in the hospital out of that area. That winter, the men who were at Fort Sully would serve guard for 11 minutes. It was limited to 11 minutes at guard because they feared that they would freeze to death if they served much longer. So the extreme cold was definitely a problem over there in the Dakota Territories and also in Iowa, in Sioux City, Iowa, where Jack was in the hospital, treated by a guy named Dr. Woods, by the way. So it was imperative that he get out of that region. So he was discharged from the Army and put on a paddle boat and sent back to St. Louis, where he was then unwelcome back home, as you might imagine. All those who had then joined the United States side and fought against their neighbors. Sam fought against the Stonewall Brigade at Spotsylvania Courthouse and destroyed it, was part of those forces destroying it. These guys were not welcome back home in Augusta County in Virginia. Not only that, but their mother back home also suffered some severe troubles. Remember that on the 28th of August, the last payment for her property that she sold during the war came due, and that sale was denominated in Confederate dollars. Well, the administrator, John Newton, the father of Jack and Sam's captain, then Major, Major Newton lost his left leg at the Battle of Winchester in 1864. And I think he was bitter. The last payment had to be recalculated, and he calculated it to be worth about $20. That's 1/3 of 334 acres, which doesn't sound just to me and didn't sound just to the widow either. She sued him. And she went to court, and the final decree came down on November 22nd, 1866. And she won. She won additional money in her settlement. But the very next day, November 23rd, 1866, she's dead. Not only that, but I've obtained court documents from the 1890s showing that John Newton illegally transferred the land that was purchased to James Fauber, the purchaser, during that 1863 auction without Virginia state seals, and that made an invalid deed transfer. So he did this. Perhaps there's no clear evidence that he murdered Betsy. There is circumstantial evidence that she died the very next day after she won the battle in court, and that he also illegally transferred the land that was sold to the buyer. The purchaser in the 1890s was the Augusta Mining Corporation, then run by James W. Newton and Major Dowell II Vines. So these are the guys who purchased the Grow property and had the deed cured in the year 1890. Well, folks, I would like to thank you for listening in on this lecture, and I would like to see if you have any questions. I'm going to stop the sharing now, and we'll come back. And I would like then to see if you folks have questions. So I'm going to go to the attendees, and if you have a question, let's see, can I turn your sound on? Select all. And you can open up the chat and see if you have any questions down there. I'll see if I can turn your mic on if you have a question. I'd just like to say that I think these guys, they risked a lot. They risked fleeing. It was dangerous to go to West Virginia. It was dangerous to be in the U.S. Army, and their units saw very rough service. But they did this because it was the right thing to do. Even though they did what they thought was right, their family back home still suffered. They suffered the thousand little indignities from the people around them. And one evidence that they continued to suffer long after the war was the fact that one of their descendants was named Robert Sheridan Grow. You might not know, but Philip Sheridan, was he had a cavalry that went down through the Shenandoah Valley and destroyed it. It was said that if a crow wanted to cross the valley, he would have to take its provisions with him. The destruction was so great through the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia after Phil Sheridan went through. But this descendant of mine, descendant of those back in the Civil War, he named his child Robert Sheridan Grow after the great Phil Sheridan. So you can tell there was a lot of discontent with people, a lot of bad feelings back and forth, both sides, long after the Civil War was over. Oh, I should also mention just one more time that my book is for sale for $1.99 on Amazon.com, and I think it's free in some contexts. So let me see if I can bring this back up. I'd like to share this with you all one more time. Share my screen, share, and I'm going to bring up, it's South Bottom, Virginia during the Civil War. It's the name of the book, South Bottom, Virginia during the Civil War. So I'll stop sharing again so you can ask any questions you may have. It's I released this book on Sunday, October the 2nd, in Amazon.com. So I put it up there. I wanted it to be available in case you had an interest in looking it over. I think the minimum price they permitted, I wanted to put up there for $0, but they wouldn't let me do it. So I had to put it up for $1.99, which was their minimum price. And so I want to thank you all for coming to this presentation about my great-great-grandfather, Jack Grow, and his brother Sam, and their experiences during the Civil War. This was a labor of love. It was a lot of research. My wife and I had to go on a lot of different trips. And I, through to Washington, D.C., and also to Virginia, we went to the Spotsylvania Courthouse battlefield, saw where Sam's group slept the night before the great battle there on the 12th of May, and where they destroyed the Stonewall Brigade that he had formerly been a member of. No. You know, there's a principle that I call Grow's law of conservation of good and evil. And that is that you pick any particular behavior, whatever it is, like say petting cats, petting kittens, whatever it is within us that causes us to pet kittens. There are examples of this throughout all history and through all time. For all time, people have taken pets. And we are going to continue to do that until we evolve to be something different, or if we somehow genetically modify ourselves to be something different. And I think the same can be said with murder, with all kinds of human behaviors. It's kind of built within us. It's a feature. So there's going to be a conserved level of this sort of behavior throughout all time. And we can see the analogies. I think these are the same sorts of people, the same needs, the same wants, the same desires, the same abilities as people today. They're very similar to us in just about every respect. And we can see a lot of analogies with what goes on today because we are the same people. And yes, um, on that homestead, it just south of that are the Waymacks, who do have some relation. They are on the old Cash Estate. I've got that picture from the Cash Estate earlier with the sunrise coming up over Groves Ridge on the old homestead. And I've been in communication with Dawn Waymack, who lives there on the property. But the Grows have all moved out. A lot of them moved to Pennsylvania shortly after the war, and also from there to West Virginia. My great-great-grandfather Jack owned a farm in West Virginia most of his adult life, and then he finally moved to Oregon along with his son. He moved there about 1915, and he passed away in 1917. Sam passed away in 1918, I believe at the age of like 84. Sam died of senile dementia in the Ohio Veterans Home where he is buried, and Jack died of dyspepsia, or so it was indigestion is how they describe it on the death certificate, which I think is a euphemism for organ failure. But there are Grows who do live in that area, and it's kind of funny because when I visited there, waking up in the morning, getting out of the hotel, and seeing people, driving up or getting out of cars or whatever. Some of those people look a lot like my dad. I could almost say that is my dad, except my dad is taller than that guy. As a guy there who's probably about 5'8", my dad is 6'2", as am I. And so people live there. They look very similar to myself and to my father. So even if they don't have the same last name, there probably is relation. I'm probably related to most everybody over there. When I've done genealogies for everyone who lived near my great-great-grandfather and his brother, I wanted to know how they were all related. And if any of them are alive today, if any of them have stories, I wanted to contact them. And so the um, the yeah, I was able to see the various relationships. I know that I was related to the Cashes and the Campbells and the Crosons and so on. A lot of the people who are in that area, even till today. So, well, I guess that's I've gone way over time. It's now 11:33. I have a class coming up at noon, and I better get ready for that. A Calculus 1 class. They're going to have a lab today. I want to make sure that's done. So I want to thank you all for coming up. It's been such a pleasure. Please take a look at my book on Amazon.com. It's titled South Bottom, and it's by me, Jeffrey Marvin Grow, a humble professor of mathematics here at Lone Star College, Montgomery. And I thank you so much for listening.